I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines, Global Health Security. How do we keep the West safe? It's become the perennial question as we enter a new era of hot war. Governments now have to grapple with the threat of a full-blown conventional conflict, alongside the hot-button topics of migration, terrorism, and spying. Some argue it's by having a strong military, projecting strength, and using hard power when needed. Others argue it's about foreign aid, investing in developing countries and using soft power. But why can't it be both? What if foreign aid and defence are two sides of the same coin? Well, for today's episode, I'm joined by someone who argues exactly that. Major General James Cowan is a former British Army officer who has commanded in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now the CEO of the world's largest humanitarian landmine clearance organisation, British charity the Halo Trust. James, welcome to Battle Lines.
Hello, Venetia. Thank you.
We're very excited to have you on. There's so much to discuss, and you really land on that perfect intersection of what we're trying to cover on this show, this nexus between security and development, aid and defence. And we think they're very interlinked, and I know you believe the same. So thrilled to have you on. I wanted to start with something that you've said in a recent op-ed. You wrote that the Halo Trust believes that true security is built not just with tanks and weapons, but with development and stability. So can you just start by explaining that for us, just laying out your core argument?
I think everybody has a backstory. And the reason why I believe that is because my professional life has really been in two parts. For the first 30 years, I was a soldier. So I'm not anti-tanks. I do think we need those things and all the modern equipments that come after tanks. But I also believe in the soft power that you've just mentioned. I think that soft power is far more affordable, but also can be extended much further than hard military power. I think the problem for this country is that over its many centuries of history, it's struggled with whether it's a continental power focused on Europe or whether it's what's called a blue water power, a maritime power extending around the world. It's never quite resolved that. And I do think, actually, to think of it in terms of hard and soft power might be a way of resolving that, because you can then focus your military here in Europe, in the immediate theatre of the European conflicts that are happening right now, and then use soft power, like my organisation, the Halo Trust, in places like Afghanistan, where it's no longer possible to send soldiers.
So you mentioned that you come to this with quite a unique set of experiences. And you, as you said you spent 3 decades working as a soldier. You've commanded soldiers in Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan. And you come from several generations of family in the army. You've called it the family business. It was an obvious choice for you to go into it. You trained at Sandhurst in 1986, and then you joined the Black Watch, Scotland's oldest and most famous infantry battalion, in 1986. You were posted to Berlin shortly after that, and I've read that you were guarding Rudolf Hess, the last of the Nazis, in Spandau prison until he died shortly afterwards. And then you witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. What was that like?
It was pretty amazing. I mean, Napoleon once said, if you want to understand a man, ask what year he was 21 in. And, you know, to have been 21 in that era was pretty remarkable. I mean, Rudolf Hess, the last of the Nazis, you know, a previous era, a piece of history, and then suddenly the wall coming down, incredibly exciting. But I think what that year of 1989 really showed to me was just how suddenly world events can change. And people get into a rhythm. They think the world is unending, unchanging. Actually, things do change very rapidly. And I do think the world that followed 1989, really up to about 2010, had a certain certainty to it. And the aid world, which I'm in now, that was the kind of glory years of aid. Sadly, that period is ending. The rules-based international order is beginning to fall apart. And I don't think it's enough to just hark back to that. I do think if I'm critical of the aid sector, it's very much nostalgic about that time. It really desperately wants to go back to it. It's not coming back. And we've got to think of the world as it's going to be in the future and not as the world as it was back then.
Just sticking with the world as it was back then, you then went to command in Iraq, and you were part of the second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004, what became one of the signature battles of the Iraq War. This involved the encirclement of Fallujah and the defeat of al-Qaeda who were occupying it. You've written that 5 of your soldiers were killed, several more were wounded. What impact did that have on you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty major impact. We'd been, the Black Watch, we'd been in the south, in the British area around Basra, and then suddenly at short notice, we were sent to support the Americans. And actually, I found, despite many criticisms of the Iraq War and of President Bush and of the Americans, I derive huge professional pleasure from working alongside our American allies. And I think the Black Watch was a very good part of that American team, largely made up of Marine Corps officers. I mean, there's two things I think it's worth pointing out. The American commander at that time was General Jim Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, who later became the Secretary for Defense in the first Trump administration. He always said that if you cut aid, I'll need to buy more bullets. He too was another guy who believed in this dichotomy of hard and soft power together. The second thing I'd say about that time is that the person we were fighting was a guy called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And al-Zarqawi was a ruthless man, a psychotic man, in my opinion, the commander of al-Qaeda in Iraq at that time. And his second in command was a certain al-Jilani, who's since changed his coat, so to speak, and is now al-Shara and leader of Syria. And I happen to think that that's a wonderful thing. Yes, he was a man of violence, but now he's turned to a peaceful future, and I think we should applaud that. We should invest in him. And I do see my life as having a continuity from that time to the present, and I very much hope for the best for Syria.
That's fascinating. And I know you've been travelling to Syria this year, so we're definitely going to talk about that in more depth. In 2009, you became a commander in Helmand province in Afghanistan, peak of fighting, lost a lot of comrades. And you jointly with more senior commanders decided on a new strategy to try and protect the people instead of just killing the enemy. Why this change in approach and how successful was it?
Funny enough, I had dinner last night with General David Petraeus, and he was really the architect of this rethink about how counterinsurgency should happen. I say a rethink. In fact, he was harking back to previous times when the British in Malaya had succeeded. And the view should be that you do not go out to kill your enemy. You set out to protect the people. And he came up with this construct of clear, hold, build, and then enable a change from an international coalition towards local forces leading. It's about protecting people, about respecting local people. And that's what we bought into in Afghanistan at that time. And I believed profoundly that was the right thing to do. It was the humane thing to do. It was the honourable thing to do, and I'm glad we did it.
How do you feel looking back on those times now, post-2021, the chaotic withdrawal of US, UK and other forces, the Taliban retaking the country? Does it feel like you failed, or you just didn't try hard enough?
It's such an important question, and one I ask myself almost every day. I think I am fortunate because I'm one of the few British soldiers who's actually gone back to Helmand.
And you've met the Taliban, right?
And I've been back. Only this June I was in Helmand. But let me take you to the events of August 2021. We had to decide, and I say we, by now I've left the army and I'm running the Halo Trust, and we have 3,500 staff across the whole of Afghanistan, the vast majority of whom are Afghans. And I remember calling my board together, and the board of the Halo Trust has some very distinguished military and foreign policy practitioners on it. And we had to decide whether we were going to try and join the evacuation from Kabul airport. We, two, a man and woman, decided that we wouldn't, that actually the safest thing for Halo was to go to ground. And the best thing for the people of Afghanistan was that we carried on our humanitarian work. So I'm so proud of the fact that actually 2.5 weeks later, after the evacuation, which we did not take part in, we came out and went back to work and carried on helping people. So it's my pleasure actually to go back to Afghanistan. It is a curious thing meeting people who were once your enemies. I went to Helmand this summer. And to land at Lashkargah, to go and meet the governor who was in the Taliban, to drive up with a Taliban escort up through the Helmand River Valley to all those places like Babaji, Nari Saraj, the Changir, up to Sangin and then to the Kajaki Dam. These are places that are famous in British military history and places that you couldn't have driven. You would have fought your way up that road very, very slowly. And there we were, on a beautiful sunny day, going up the road and then stopping and having a picnic lunch with some fried fish beside the Helmand River. I mean, things can change, peace can happen, a better future can dawn for a country. And of course, there's much about the Taliban that I deplore. I think it is absolutely disgraceful the way they are treating women and girls. and that needs to change. But it's not going to change if we stand off from many thousands of miles away and just wag our fingers at them. We should be patient. We should be persistent. We should be insistent as well. But a little like, Saudi Arabia's changed hugely, so the Taliban can in time as well if we stay engaged. And that's my kind of answer for all those British soldiers who must wonder whether it was worth it. I totally understand that. But I hope that my perspective of seeing what's happened to that country now, and there can be a better future, is one that's worth seeing, and it can help people through what is often very difficult times. And I know a lot of soldiers mentally struggle with the Helmand campaign, but I hope this is a sort of answer to that.
To what extent were you already starting to think about that post-conflict recovery process while you were still a soldier? When there was unexploded ordnance that you see in your line of duty, Were you thinking about the impact that would have further down the line, or was that not part of your day-to-day?
I think I came to see war less in a linear way, i.e. pre-war, war, post-war, than a cycle of conflict. And I realised that, in fact, statistically, the countries most likely to go into war are the ones that have just come out of war, because fragility, the breakdown of rule of law, poverty, human rights abuses, sexual violence, food insecurity, lack of education, these are the consequences of war, but they're also the causes of war. And I've always thought of it as that cycle. And I see what I do now with the Halo Trust as being part of trying to break that cycle.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Halo Trust. You became CEO in 2015. Why the Halo Trust? And I'm wondering if there was any relationship with your previous career as a soldier. Was there any sense of wanting to redress that and doing some work that was related to the sphere of conflict?
Well, I think you've got to do what you're good at. And, I was never going to be a nuclear physicist or
Fair enough.
or doing surgery. Please, nobody wants me for that. So you've got to do what you're reasonably good at. And I think I'm reasonably good at organising large bodies of people. And Halo is a big organisation. I think I'm reasonably militarily literate. And Halo is not a military charity, but it is dealing with conflict. Maybe some would see it as poacher turned gamekeeper. I don't see it that way. I do actually think that, foreign policy is the exercise of really three things. The coercive, namely what the military have, the persuasive, what a foreign office has, and then the altruistic, which is really what aid money is about. And it's about taking those three things and bringing them together in ways that are coherent. And I think too often in the past, particularly in this country, we've treated these things tribally. Those who used to work for the old DFID didn't want anything to do with the military and vice versa. I think that's a really poor way to structure foreign affairs. And whilst overseas aid has been cut substantially, I think what is left now needs to be far more focused on the thing that really matters in our world right now, which in my opinion is, alongside the climate crisis, is conflict, because we've lifted lots of people out of poverty. Old school development activity I don't think is appropriate any longer. It's much better done by trade anyway. And we should focus that remaining money on ruthlessly handling these appalling conflicts in Sudan or in Gaza or in Ukraine and making a significant difference.
So what does Halo Trust do? Tell me exactly what you guys... It's landmine clearance, but you do other activities as well. You clean up weapons and there's a humanitarian element as well. So just run us through
basically,
what Trust works on.
We do three things. We tackle rural landmine contamination, so huge minefields in countries like Ukraine. The Ukrainians estimate about 150,000 square kilometres of their country is contaminated by landmines. Syria has a similar problem, but many, many other countries in the world, places like Cambodia, Zimbabwe, Angola. The thing is with landmines is that they are plastic, hermetically sealed units, so the water doesn't get in, so they don't corrode, and they are designed to kill or maim a soldier, but many, many decades after the event, they will kill or maim an innocent civilian. So that's why they're evil. They're very, very indiscriminate. The second piece of work we do is urban bomb disposal. The sad reality is that as people are moving to cities, so war is moving to cities. I was recently in Syria, where vast amounts of Syria's building stock has been destroyed or damaged. And it's even worse in Gaza. 82% of Gaza's buildings are damaged or destroyed. So bomb disposal in an urban environment is hugely important to allow populations to return home. All those Gazans coming back in to where their house was to try and rebuild it. Very often there will be an unexploded bomb somewhere in the construct, or underground there might be a Hamas tunnel. Those explosives will be absolutely lethal to any innocent civilians. And the third thing we do is weapon control. Across huge parts of the world, in, let's say, Latin America, West Africa, the Balkans, there are vast uncontrolled stocks of weapons. And if in the wrong hands, they will restart conflict. So a good example would be Syria, actually, where recently there's been quite well publicised violence between Druze and Sunnis and Alawites. And that's all about weapons falling outside of government control. So we're part of that solution, and we intend to be offering that particular service in Gaza as well, where, again, not only Hamas, but the clans there are heavily armed.
Lots to get into there. Let's start with landmines, and maybe we can use Ukraine as a sort of case study. How big is the problem of landmines globally?
So it's almost impossible to tell how many landmines have been laid. And one of the things I'm really keen to drive at is embracing the tech revolution so that we can better understand the problem. And what we're very excited by is the marriage of open source imagery, whether it be satellite imagery or drone imagery, with artificial intelligence. And if we can machine learn AI to look at aerial images, a human eye can take a photograph, it can look at it, it can see where the landmines are, but it won't do it as well as AI, which can do it at huge speed, but also very, very accurately. And if we can process the whole of Ukraine, Ukrainians are estimating it's going to cost literally $40 billion to clear their country of landmines. I mean, that actually will prove not to be the case, because forensic survey will bring that problem down to a much tighter definition, and it might be possible to do it, $4 or $5 billion. What an enormous saving that would be for very little actual effort. So that's very exciting. We're also very, very keen to embrace mechanization, robotics, and ultimately autonomy. So autonomous vehicles are already coming into the agricultural sector, and we have some very exciting partnerships with big agri-businesses. But what if we could do the same, have unmanned vehicles working 24/7, clearing landmines, and we could make a really substantial difference finding mines. So my aim strategically is to accelerate the speed of clearance from that kind of old school hands and knees, very, very painstaking work to something super fast. Ukraine doesn't want to have landmines in 5 years' time. It needs to be done with it. And we can be part of that solution.
If people have heard of the Halo Trust outside of your work, they might think of Diana walking through that landmine field in Angola. And I know Prince Harry continues to do work for you guys and was in Angola earlier this year. What are the sort of different contexts in which you might need to use manual landmine detection, someone on their hands and knees, as you mentioned, versus using more high-tech solutions like drones and OSINT?
So, the first thing is that our work creates employment. And in many parts of the world, rural unemployment, the brutal, grinding poverty of very isolated communities means that they're absolutely desperate for the work that we create. So that's tremendous. We offer training, we can help with literacy and numeracy, we can offer leadership roles, and once the work is done, we can then offer small holdings on the cleared land, and it's now decontaminated, and somebody who was a deminer can then become a farmer or run a shop or whatever it is to help them earn a living for the future. And the people who really especially benefit from this are women. 10 years ago, very few women employed in demining. Now I've got to 50% female workforces in many, many parts of the Halo world. And that's really exciting for me because they're incredibly meticulous, hardworking. And then out of it, if they are a single parent, head of family, their lives will be absolutely transformed by this. So that is why manual clearance is important. But there are other sort of geographic reasons. If you're trying to protect jungle in Cambodia, you don't want to bring in big mechanical assets to tear down the trees. You want to work well with that natural environment to preserve it. So that might be a reason, or it might be halfway up a mountain. There will always be reasons why manual clearance is necessary and mechanical assets can't be used. So we still have a very large workforce, and we're incredibly proud of the fact that workforce is local. We're not hiring millions of expensive British people. we're employing Afghans or Angolans or Somalis or Zimbabweans, and we're empowering people in their own countries to be in charge of their own destiny.
I just want to give our listeners a sense of the casualties caused by landmines. The Landmine Monitor in 2024 reported at least 5,700 casualties from landmines. Where are the worst places in the world for these sort of legacy landmines that are still taking out civilians? And I believe it's more than 80% of casualties of landmines are civilians globally.
So I think landmines are one thing. I mean, a lot of our work is about cluster munitions and the homemade landmine, the IED. So there is a kind of, sadly, a much broader series of classes of weapons that we have to deal with. Those numbers are actually relatively small because they're underreported. In large parts of the world, like Sudan, it's very, very hard to know how many people are actually being killed. But I think it's also worth looking beyond the actual narrow numbers of casualties, because what landmines do is deny land to human beings, and that creates poverty, it creates malnourishment, it stops. I've been to many a location in Afghanistan where a school can't open because it's surrounded by IEDs, so children not being educated. The director of the World Health Organization said the best vaccine is peace, and so often health outcomes are incredibly impaired by violence, war, and the presence of landmines. Given
all of that, does it worry you that Ukraine has become the sixth country recently to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention, which banned landmines? As a former soldier, you obviously understand the military rationale why these countries who all share a border with Russia, it's also Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Poland shares a border with Belarus, which we can probably call a vassal state of Russia at this point. You can understand the military rationale why these countries want to do it. How do you argue against them using this tool to defend themselves from an aggressive enemy state? What's the argument that you put forward as both a former soldier and now humanitarian?
So I think there's some really complex and quite difficult moral arguments both ways on this subject. And my honest opinion is that I can see both sides of this argument. And I do think that what's really important is people are respectful of each other's opinions on this. And too often people take very hardline positions. The reality of war in the last 100 years, really since the First World War, following the slaughter of the trenches, is we never want to see that happen again. And we have, in our age, substituted steel for blood. Instead of sending millions of young men to their deaths, we found technological solutions, steel, not blood. And that has a moral logic to it. So the numbers of soldiers killed in the Second World War was about half that of the First World War British soldiers. And so on, it's gone. The Korean War, tiny numbers, even fewer in Northern Ireland, even fewer in Afghanistan, despite the horror of it. Actually, 456 British dead in Helmand, it's far fewer than the First or Second World Wars. And there is something to be pleased about there. So therefore, I struggle morally. If I was a Ukrainian and I was sending my young men to their deaths in those trenches, if I could find some technological way of protecting their lives, I can't really in my heart of hearts object to that. But I run a humanitarian organisation. I don't want people to leave what's called the Ottawa Landmine Ban Convention. I'm a keen proponent of Syria, for instance, joining the treaty. I think it would get huge benefits from doing so, becoming part of the rules-based system. But I'm a pragmatist. And my job ultimately with the Halo Trust is to go out there and clear up these things and to remove them as quickly as possible from the battlefield. I am not going to be out there criticising Ukraine or the United States for gifting those mines to Ukraine. So I'm taking a nuanced position. I know that for people with very strong views, that's not what they believe. I am very respectful of their views, but I hope they can see there is a more sophisticated and complex argument to be made.
Isn't it also fundamentally contradictory? You're going out and you're cleaning up these landmines, and meanwhile, you're not criticising the people who are laying more landmines, sort of creating more work for you to do further down the line.
And that's what I mean by the complexity of this problem. But I think that in all things in life, there will be a time and place where something is needed and a time and place where something is not needed. The law of armed conflict talks about things like proportionality and necessity, distinction, humanity. We've got to apply those principles to how we go about dealing with classes of weapons. because war is ultimately something all of us should wish to avoid, but sometimes it can become, in the last resort, a necessary means of self-defence, and self-defence is inherent to the UN Charter.
The Halo Trust has recently started going into Gaza. Just paint a picture of the scale of the problem, and how are you prioritising where you're starting to deal with unexploded ordnance?
So Halo's been working on the West Bank for many years now. So we are very expert in the region. We've also, by virtue of our programmes in Yemen and in Syria, Iraq and Libya, we have a lot of experience of urban contamination. So we're very well placed. We were in Gaza until January, and of course with the breakdown of the ceasefire in January, we had sadly to take the decision to withdraw, but we only came out into Israel, so we weren't far away. And we really waited and took our time to see when the circumstances would be right. Now, of course, the ceasefire that President Trump has negotiated, I do think is a diplomatic triumph. I think it's extraordinarily effective, but it's not yet enough. And, he has done something historic and he should be applauded for it. But there is still a lot of work to go before what is just a ceasefire turns into a long-lasting peace. There's a great deal to be done, and I'm very alive to that reality. Nevertheless, our humanitarian duty is to be in there. We are beginning the process of surveying where the contamination is. It's not a landmine problem. It's really a twofold problem. It's unexploded Israeli ordnance, whether artillery or air-delivered bombs, and then Hamas and their tunnels, their explosives, their caches of weapons. And we are well able, through our years of experience and expertise, to handle this. The Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, came to my headquarters recently and has announced £4 million of British money for our work in Gaza, which is very exciting. We have a number of other governments supporting our work there. So we are intending to scale up from 5 teams to 100 teams. A team is really some ammunition technical officers, driver, medic, a small team of high-end skills, very, very highly experienced bomb disposal people. This is not landmine clearance. This is not going to be possible to be done by thousands of locally recruited people. Instead, it's a much more sophisticated bomb disposal capability that we're delivering. And we're going to move from 5 teams where we are today to 100 teams. So it's going to be large-scale work. But given that so much of Gaza has been damaged, in amongst the rubble, vast numbers of unexploded bombs, and we're going to go in there. And as communities come back in and find these things, first of all, we're going to do what's called risk education. So teaching people not to touch, just to call us out. We will then come out and destroy the item. And that way we can help accelerate the process of recovery. It's not just dwellings, it's offices, it's businesses, it's schools, it's hospitals, it's health centres, it's roads. The whole infrastructure of Gaza is absolutely paralysed by these munitions, and the whole recovery process absolutely has bomb disposal at its heart for Gaza to get back up and running again.
And what about the process of getting weapons off Hamas, that sort of third tranche of work that you said you work on at the Halo Trust? How's that going? And I'm curious as well, given your professional experience as a soldier working in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, the decommissioning of weapons was a huge part of defanging that conflict. Yeah. I'm wondering if there are lessons that you're hoping can be taken forward to Gaza when that process gets up and running, if Hamas is willing. Yeah.
So I do think in conflict, so often the greatest mistake soldiers make is to fight the last war. And, each conflict needs to be taken on its own merits. There are some similarities with Northern Ireland, but, it's a fundamentally different process. The IRA, for whatever one thinks about them, they were a very organised and disciplined construct. And when they decided to hand in their weapons, that was a top-down process. Now, there were, of course, distant Irish Republicans who splintered away from that. But on the whole, when the IRA decided to surrender its weapons, it did so. That's not going to be the case in a place like Gaza, where, frankly, Hamas has been very much splintered by the killing and capturing of its senior leadership, where it isn't just Hamas. There are other foreign terrorist organisations present in Gaza, and of course there's some very powerful clans, families at work there. So weapon holdings extend throughout the whole population. It's a much more complex, far more daunting prospect. So I wouldn't draw too many parallels to Northern Ireland.
Do you feel optimistic in that particular conflict that your work can make a difference, or do you worry that, for example, this ceasefire will collapse? It's so wobbly anyway. Some say it's a ceasefire in all but name, that your work will then have to be paused and restarted. I imagine a lot of the work that you did before you pulled out in January has already been reset by the conflict since March.
I think President Trump deserves some credit for this, to have got Prime Minister Netanyahu to the negotiating table, to get the Israelis to want to do this voluntarily. I think it's tremendous. I do think this is in Israel's own interests. Our work will help protect Israel because we will take out of circulation weapons that could be reused against Israel in the future. And I do think this is in the interests of the Palestinian population. But we must be realistic. There is no real force generation mechanism yet to create the force that's supposed to go in to keep the peace. I don't see much appetite for a peace enforcement mission. I do think the issues around Hamas are real. And so this will take very persistent engagement by the United States to make it happen. And it's such great momentum that the president has achieved, and he's now got to sustain that momentum. I know he has many other things to concern himself with, but this will take persistent engagement at the very highest levels of the US administration to make sure it does not fall apart.
Let's move on to Syria, where you've been travelling earlier this year, and you're trying to gather up weapons from the fallout from that civil war as well. How's that going?
So it's early days. I mean, we've worked in Syria since 2016, so we've been there a long time, and we were up in the northwest, so the same part of the country that the new president is from. And so we have an open door, really, because we were not associated in any way with President Assad. But now that we are able to work across the whole country, just the sheer scale of this contamination is genuinely remarkable. Having stood in the middle of one of the largest minefields in the world only a few weeks ago, that which delineated the two sides, and that minefield shifted over time as the front line shifted. So the contamination is massive. And this is some of the finest farmland in the whole of the Middle East. It ought to be the breadbasket of that part of Central Asia. And it isn't yet. But it can be into the future. So we see a huge amount of work for Halo. We're going to bring many of the skills we've developed in Ukraine. It's very much the same problem set. Russian mines, Russian minefields laid out in the same way as in Ukraine. So we can bring all those skills from Ukraine to Syria, and Syria can be the beneficiary of what we've learned in Ukraine. So I'm very excited by that. But it is early days, and my concern is that the world has so many different priorities right now that I worry that people will not mobilize enough resources for this, and that the fragility of the new regime will begin to suffer, not because people are hostile to it, but because of neglect.
I saw that you mentioned it's a 200-kilometre mine belt running across the former front line. Is that, help me understand, is that all Russian landmines? Have other people been laying it? Do you know fairly precisely sort of what you're dealing with and where you need to take it all out?
Yeah, so I mean, both sides laid mines, but the vast majority were Russian. And so we are beginning that survey process alongside clearance at the same time. And we have a pretty good idea because it's open farmland. It really does give itself well to the kinds of open satellite imagery, source imagery that we have. And we can do that survey extremely effectively. So we know how to get our arms around the problem. We just need the money and resources now to conduct large-scale clearance.
I know for some of our listeners this will feel like a faraway problem, post-conflict Syria, not really anything to do with us, but you've argued really powerfully that it does affect us here in the West. It affects migration, helps to curb irregular migration. Can you explain that connection for us?
There have been 5 great crises that have hit this country since the millennium. 9/11, the financial crash of 2008, Brexit, COVID, and the Ukraine war. And, we're not an island isolated where we can cut ourselves off. We can't be Little Britain. We are actually connected intrinsically, umbilically to the rest of the world. We've got to face that reality. These problems will come to us. And the huge migration wave that came out of Syria was a direct consequence of Assad's war. The migration wave that's come out of Afghanistan is the same. The Halo Trust has allowed about 4 million people to live on land cleared partly with British money. The British give us £2.5 million a year there. That's tremendous. But it's nothing compared to the money spent every day, £4.5 million every day, on hotels in and around Brighton. So actually, the British are getting fantastic value for money by doing this upstream work. Why would anyone want to leave their country if they could stay peacefully, farm their land, live a happy life in their own country? They don't want all the risk and dangers of migration, illegal migration, and we should help them achieve that. So there's not just a humanitarian imperative here. There's actually our own selfish interest in making this work.
It's such a hot button topic, isn't it? Migration in particular in Britain at the moment and in a lot of the West. And various political parties are trying to find ways to deal with it. And then we've also got this, as you mentioned earlier in this episode, dichotomy. Earlier this year, Labour said that it would cut its aid spending to 0.3% by 2027, and it's boosting defence spending to 2.6%, aiming to reach 3% of GDP by next Parliament. The Tories have said that they want to slash international aid even further, down to 0.1%, and Reform want to cut it even further, and I hope I've got my maths here right, to 0.03%. Really tiny numbers. I just want to go back to that quote that I mentioned at the beginning, which is your quote, about defence and aid spending being two sides of the same coin. Why do you think it's a false argument that we should be bringing down international aid spending and raising defence spending?
Well, first of all, I actually applaud the Labour government for, amongst the three parties, you've just listed them in the order in which they're willing to spend on aid, and I applaud the Labour government for keeping aid at that level. Of course, I wish it were higher. These are difficult times for our Chancellor. But
so
at
you
least,
think that's still a good number then?
Well, I think it's a hell of a lot better than what the Tories or Reform propose, and therefore we should stick with it, and so I applaud that. I wish it were higher. I think it should go back to its former level in due course, but I'm a realist, and it is what it is for now. I also applaud the increase in defence spending. These are all instruments in the same orchestra, and we've got to use those instruments to make not only Britain a safer place, but the world a safer place, because unless the world is safe, Britain isn't safe. And, across the world right now, if you look, the prospect of perhaps war in Venezuela, the collapse of Mali, the numbers of coups in the Sahel, the appalling humanitarian suffering in Sudan, forgotten wars in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Tigray, the conflict in Ukraine, where 1.2 million Russians and 600,000 Ukrainians are casualties, the wars of the Middle East, the appalling suffering of Gaza and of Syria, the continuing plight of Afghanistan, and a completely forgotten war in Myanmar. Our whole world, before our very eyes, is in slow motion going into conflict. And we are planning to ignore those things? I don't think so. We, as a nation, have a long and proud tradition of making the world a safer place. We must never give up on that.
Do you think enough people are making that argument? You are clearly, but is it being heard?
I don't think enough people are. And I think that politics has degenerated into a very, very localised agenda in which people think that their vote depends upon highly localised issues. And I want to put the argument that actually we need to think more broadly, not because we're just being altruistic and trying to be do-gooders, but because there is a genuine national interest that will make our country not only safer, but actually wealthier in the long run. Britain is an island. It's a trading nation. Our country's wealth, our safety, our security is based upon having a world that is not angry with us, does not wish to do us harm. And we have been an incredibly effective force for good in achieving that over many, many decades. We must not give up on this. And we will be the better for it. We can achieve for our nation a better economic future if we invest in foreign assistance, in overseas aid, in defence. These things are absolutely intrinsic to that same economic outcome.
Have the aid cuts affected the Halo Trust? Where does the Halo Trust get most of its money from?
At the start of this year, all US foreign assistance was stopped. But actually, President Trump quite quickly restored our work we're actually having as much US money as ever. So that's wonderful. But European money, and I include the UK in that, has gone down. I do worry about this. So my solution is to offset that by raising private support. Strategically, I've shifted Halo from being largely, entirely dependent on state money to being about a third now raising private support. So we have some fantastic private philanthropists, corporate supporters, people of vision, family offices and foundations that support our work and can see that war just has an appalling effect on children's lives, on women's lives, upon the sick, upon the elderly, upon the natural environment. And I think people want to be part of that, and they can see the urgency to get behind this and help us make the world safer.
James Cowan, CEO of the Halo Trust, thank you very much for coming on Battle Lines Global Health Security.
Thank you very much indeed.